Hi everyone, for my Flashpoint video, I will be covering the topic of friendly rebels, U.S. strategic aid to the Mujahideen, and the Contras. In his State of the Union speech on February 6, 1985, President Ronald Reagan stated, "We must not break faith with those who are risking their lives on every continent, from Afghanistan to Nicaragua, to defy Soviet-supported aggression and to secure rights which have been ours from birth." During the 1970s, and 1980s, the Cold War was still raging across the globe, with hotspots continually popping up. And two of those hotspots include the Soviet-Afghan War, which ended up causing the United States to aid the Mujahideen, and the Iran-Contra affair. As I begin, one of the most important things to understand in all of this is the Reagan Doctrine. This was President Reagan's foreign policy toward the Soviet Union and was the immense buildup of American military forces and the backbone for his plan to roll back communism across the globe, primarily in Afghanistan, as seen with aid to the Mujahideen, Cambodia, Angola, and Nicaragua, as seen with the aid to the Contras. This doctrine was made public during Reagan's State of the Union speech in February of 1985, but it had been a part of Reagan's foreign policy since the beginning of his presidency in 1981. This doctrine was very heavily anti-communist and was also the streamlined version of America's anti-containment policy. For historical timeline purposes, we're going to begin with the U.S. aid to the Mujahideen. When looking at this event, it is important to put this into historical context, starting with the nation's leaders. So we're going to begin with the leaders of the Soviet Union. To begin, we have Leonid Brezhnev, who was leader of the Soviet Union from 1964 to 1982, Yuri Andropov, who was leader of the Soviet Union from 1982 to 1981, Konstantin Shchenko, who was leader of the Soviet Union from 1984 to 1985, and Mikhail Gorbachev, who was president of the Soviet Union from 1985 to 1991. Continuing on with nations leaders, we have the leaders of the United States. President Jimmy Carter, who was president of the United States from 1977 to 1981. He was the president at the beginning of the aid to the Mujahideen. President Ronald Reagan, who was president of the United States from 1981 to 1989, who was president during the time of most of the aid to the Mujahideen. Barack Karmal, who was leader of Afghanistan from 1979 to 1986. And Burhanuddin Rabbani, who was leader of the Mujahideen. There were also other leaders of the Mujahideen, but he was the primary leader of the Mujahideen. So, what prompted U.S. aid to the Mujahideen? So let's start by putting this in context. In 1973, the Afghan Civil War began when Mohammed Daoud staged a coup against King Zahir, and you can see both of those men on the screen. And that coup ended up being successful. But in order to be successful, Daoud was reliant on aid from the Soviet Union. Daoud ended up taking control of the government of Afghanistan and worked hard to get away from Soviet influence and improve foreign relations with the United States. This, of course, did not make the Soviet Union happy. In April of 1978, communist opposition to Daoud rose up and ended up killing him, installing a new communist prime minister, Mir Muhammad Taraki, as you can see on this slide, and deputy prime minister, who is none other than Barack Karmal, as you saw on the previous slide. Due to this takeover, the communist alarm was sounded in Washington, D.C. In response, President Jimmy Carter recognized the new government and sat an ambassador to Afghanistan. Just a few months later, Karmal learned of plans to overthrow the communist regime that was in power. Also during this time, the Soviet Union had been dispatching troops to Bagram Air Force Base, which you can see on this slide, which again prompted Jimmy Carter to begin supplying non-lethal aid to the Mujahideen, who were a group of Islamic insurgents that were protesting the communist government. Months of aid followed, and things seemed to be fine, but still a little bit tense. Then things really intensified. On December 24th, 1979, the USSR invaded Afghanistan and killed the prime minister and made Barack Karmal the head of their puppet communist government. And you can see the map of the Soviet invasion on this slide. This invasion prompted an immediate response from the United States, but not one that many people expected. At this time, President Jimmy Carter was preoccupied with the Iran hostage crisis that was taking place at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. So he initially sent Brezhnev a letter denouncing Soviet aggression. Carter also stated in his State of the Union speech that he would protect Middle Eastern oil supplies from Soviet power, which was important because at this point in his presidency, inflation was through the roof and there were gas shortages across the country, and the United States was also very reliant on Middle Eastern oil. He also stated that there would be economic sanctions and trade embargoes against the Soviet Union. And the event that most people remember was that the United States boycotted the 1980 Olympic Games that were being held in Moscow. And he also stepped up aid to the Mujahideen. Following Reagan's placement in office in 1981, the aid to the Mujahideen was stepped up and dubbed Operation Cyclone. This aid was controlled by the Central Intelligence Agency and ranged from $20 to $30 million in 1980 and then ended up being $630 million in 1987. The aid was also sponsored in part by Pakistani intelligence, which they were rewarded through assistance programs, which led to some issues within the George H.W. Bush administration with buyback programs of the arms and aid that they were given. So how does this all end? In the mid-1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union and realized that the regime was going to fall. The falling of the regime was due in part to Reagan's ability to ramp up U.S. military production, which in turn threatened the Soviets. In response, the Soviets tried to do the same, but were unsuccessful due to their economic shortcomings. Now, this wasn't the only reason why the Soviet Union fell, but it does contribute to the falling of the regime. In 1989, Gorbachev withdrew his troops from Afghanistan, which in turn led to the first Afghan civil war between the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan and the Mujahideen. The civil war ended in 1992 with the Mujahideen claiming the victory and setting up the Islamic State of Afghanistan. Shortly following that civil war, another civil war broke out, which was fought between the Islamic State of Afghanistan and the Hebzi Islami Al-Buddin and the Taliban. This resulted in a Taliban victory and resulted in the Taliban controlling the country. But what about just war and Christian ethics in all of this? Many people would conclude that the aid to the Mujahideen was something that needed to happen and something that was justified. The world couldn't afford to lose Afghanistan to communism, and of course the ideas of containment, the Reagan Doctrine, and the security of Middle Eastern oil were all reasons why the aid was given. Now remember, this aid was primarily non-lethal, and the United States supplied no troops in Afghanistan. To put this in perspective with the current event, the U.S. is currently giving aid to Ukraine during the war with Russia. This parallels to the aid to the Mujahideen because we are supplying aid to the Ukrainian military without actually putting boots on the ground, which is basically what we were doing in the 1980s. I would argue that this is an important and just action to take because we can't let an imperialistic power like the Soviet Union and now Russia, as well as China, flex their muscles and follow through with blatant imperialism. The only issue that many people talk about in this case is the fact the United States was giving aid to an Islamic insurgent group, which have been referred to as jihadists. And the issue of jihad is on the extreme end of warfare and just about as far away from just war as you can get. I would argue that the United States should have attempted to intervene just slightly once the civil wars broke out, and especially once the Taliban took power because of the humanitarian issues that would come to light during this time. Now, this is a little bit ironic because Afghanistan is controlled by the Taliban again right now. But this control of Afghanistan in the present, of course, is following the United States' long presence in Afghanistan following 9/11 and the subsequent war on terror. Another aspect of this that makes this a black mark is the fact that many people suspect that the aid that was given to the Mujahideen ended up being used by Osama bin Laden and his terrorist group Al-Qaeda, which carried out the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Essentially, the aid that was given to the Mujahideen was helping terrorist groups based in Afghanistan. Again, all of this is speculation and nothing has been confirmed, but it's a pretty high possibility. Now, moving on to our second event, the Iran-Contra affair. I want to point out the nation leaders at this time of crisis. So during this time, we have President Ronald Reagan, who was president of the United States from 1981 to 1989. Syed Ruhollah Mohseni Khomeini, who was supreme leader of Iran from 1979 to 1989. Daniel Ortega, who was president of Nicaragua and the leader of the Sandinistas from 1979 to 1985, and the Contras. Their leaders were Adolfo Calero, Enrique Bermudez, among others. They're kind of like the Mujahideen, where they had some bigger leaders, but there was a lot of people that also led. Let's begin with some background in Nicaragua. During this time, the Sandinistas, a communist political party that was backed by Cuba and the Soviet Union, were in power in the country. Once the country fell to the Sandinistas, the United States State Department was worried that El Salvador and Guatemala would fall to the same fate. Historically, Nicaragua had been funded by the United States due to the past good neighbor foreign policy in Latin America. When Reagan became president, he realized that the Sandinistas were supplying arms to communist regimes in El Salvador, so he pulled the plug on funding in the country. Because of the Sandinistas being aligned with the communists, Reagan looked for ways to get rid of the communist regime in the country. And remember, this all harkens back to the Reagan doctrine that I explained at the beginning of the video. With that in mind, aid to the Contras began. The first aid was provided by Argentina in the form of money, arms, and equipment through some U.S. funding. It's important to recognize here that the Contras were the anti-communist group. The Sandinistas were the communist group. The Contras were the anti-communist group. But in December of 1982, the Boland Amendment was passed by Congress. This amendment made it so that way the United States could not use funds to overthrow the Nicaraguan government or provoke war during against Honduras and Nicaragua. But there was a loophole in this law. The U.S. could aid the Contras as long as they didn't overthrow the government. So policy was shifted and aid was continued with attacks by the Contras, and even CIA-led attacks on oil fields. But in 1984, the second Boland Amendment was passed, which prohibited the funding of the Contras with U.S. funds entirely. This ended up making the Reagan administration shift their policy dramatically. In order to keep funding the Contras, Reagan sent Robert McFarlane, his national security advisor, to get more funding for the Contras. McFarlane asked the Israelis and was denied, but he ended up getting some funding from Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, and some other countries. But it wasn't enough. In the midst of all of this, the Intelligence Authorization Act was passed, which outlawed U.S. agencies from soliciting money from third-party countries to the Contras. But the U.S. State Department could give money for humanitarian aid. So at this point, the Reagan administration was at a standstill when it came to helping the Contras. Shifting from background with Nicaragua, it's also important to understand the background with Iran. Following World War II, the United States had become an ally with Iran, mostly because of the need for oil in the region. The two countries were allies until the Shah was overthrown and the Ayatollah gained power in Iran in 1979. Iran suddenly became an openly anti-American country. It's important to remember here that the Shah was an American-placed government in the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration, which was the main reason why it was friendly to the United States. Following the revolution and the takeover by the Ayatollah, the United States attempted to continue relations with Iran, but they were not able to achieve the relations that they wanted. This came to a head in 1979 when the U.S. Embassy in Iran was seized, which took place during the Carter administration. The hostages taken at the embassy were eventually released in 1981, right as Reagan took the oath of office. But our Iranian relations were never the same. In addition, Iran had a history of funding terrorist groups, most notably Hezbollah, which the Americans were very much against. Despite all of the relationship issues between the United States and Iran, the Iran-Iraq War was raging in the Middle East and had been since 1980. In 1985, the Iranians were desperate for weapons. Also during this time, there were numerous hostages being held by the Iran-backed terrorist group Hezbollah in Lebanon. Because the Iranians were desperate for weapons for their fight against Iraq, talks were opened with the United States, and the United States was desperate to get its citizens back. So naturally, the Reagan administration saw an opening. Now, with the background with Nicaragua and Iran understood, now we can get into the beginnings of the affair. Remember that the Bolin Amendments and the Intelligence Authorization Act made it so that way the United States could not supply aid to the Contras, and so the Reagan administration was trying to find a way to get aid to the Contras, regardless of what the law said. Well, the Reagan administration saw their opening when the Iranians requested weapons. The Reagan administration, Iran, and Israel all came up with a plan. This plan was somewhat simple, but also quite complex. The United States would supply weapons to Iran through a middleman, and that middleman ended up being Israel. So essentially, the United States would ship the weapons to Israel, and the Israelis would ship their weapons to Iran. But the payment for these weapons had to be kept secret. This meant that a secret bank account was set up. And this bank account was in none other than a Swiss bank and was owned and monitored by a third party dubbed the Enterprise. From this bank account, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North would divert the funds from this account to the Contras once the Iranians deposited the funds in it. But in order to keep the weapons coming, the Iranians also had to ensure that the hostages would be released and that the weapons were paid for. For all intents and purposes, this plan seemed to be working. The United States was getting what they wanted, the hostages held by Hezbollah returned to American soil, and money to aid the Contras. This affair lasted from August of 1985 to November of 1986, with hundreds of weapons supplied to Iran, millions of dollars diverted to the Contras, and some of the hostages released. Now, how does all of this end? The affair was brought to a screeching halt in November of 1986 after the breaking of the story by two Lebanese newspapers. This led the American media to report and run numerous stories, some true and some untrue. In immediate response, Reagan denied that he knew anything about the affair, but quickly retracted the statement. In response to this, Reagan addressed the nation on November 13, 1986, addressing the facts of the matter where he famously stated, "They're going to hear the facts from a White House source, and you know my name." In this address, Reagan told the American people why he took the actions he did, telling them that it was a needed diplomatic mission. Reagan actually addressed the nation multiple times while this affair was happening, but this was the first time that he addressed the nation. But in this address, he did not address the fact that the money from the sale of the arms was going to the Contras in Nicaragua. Everyone in the United States believed that the scandal would come to haunt and back to bite Reagan. Over the next few years, there were congressional hearings and private investigations. But through all of this, Reagan left office with a very high approval rating, as you can see on this slide, and is regarded as one of the best and most revered presidents in American history. Now, Reagan himself was never charged in court regarding his part of the affair, but his national security advisors Robert McFarlane and John Poindexter, his Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger, who was later pardoned by President George H.W. Bush, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, and 4 CIA officers were tried and convicted for their actions in the affair. The scandal remains a black mark on Reagan's presidency. Sorry about that. So the question now is, what about just war and Christian ethics? This situation is one that is really hard for me to justify. I do think that it was right to aid the Contras, just like it was right to aid the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. I also agree with Reagan that communism needed to be stopped, and the United States could have a helping hand in that. But Reagan started to get into murky waters when he went around U.S. law and aiding the Contras. This was clearly illegal and a step that Reagan should not have taken. I also believe that the supplying of weapons to Iran was wrong because Iran was known for funding and helping terrorist organizations carry out attacks across the globe. And many of those attacks have jihadist intentions. And as we know, jihad is on an extreme end of the just war spectrum. I also believe that Reagan lied because he said that he would never negotiate with terrorists. And in a roundabout way, he negotiated with terrorists in order to get the hostages released from their terrorist holders through the country that was backing them. Now, don't get me wrong. I totally agree that we needed to get our American citizens back. But the way that he went around U.S. law and getting the hostages back was what the problem was. All in all, I believe that the scandal could have been prevented if the Reagan administration would have just told the Contras they could no longer fund them, regardless of the doctrine that they had released due to federal law and restrictions. Reagan himself even stated that he would take full responsibility for his actions and the actions of his administration, and that he regretted the scandal. In conclusion, these are just two events that we can look at in American history and critique. We have to realize that foreign policy is something that is hard to craft and is never truly perfect. As Christians, I believe that we should look at past, present, and future foreign policy through a just and Christian lens, while also remembering that we live in a sinful world that will never be fixed until Christ comes back. Here are my resources. And with that, thank you for watching.